What's up, friends? Glad you're joining me on the Challenging Conversation show, brought to you by the Edify Podcast Network. Challenging Conversations is intended to empower Christians to be bold and not afraid to jump into controversial topics with anyone on any topic, anytime. I'm excited today to have on the show Professor Nancy Pearcey, author of many books such as Total Truth, Liberating Christianity from Its Cultural Captivity, and Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. So if you've never read any of those books, I encourage you guys to get them. But today, Professor Pearcey and I will be discussing her latest book, published by Baker Books, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Nancy, thanks for coming on Challenging Conversations.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I've been definitely someone who's dived into a lot of your books, and the titles are very appealing, but the content themselves are very powerful, the way that you guide and instruct Christians to think critically, but to do it in love. And so great to have you on the show, because obviously on this platform, we want to make sure that Christians know what they believe, but to do it in love, as the Bible says in Ephesians 4:15, to speak the truth in love. So you definitely have been a great example of that. So I want to dive right into a particular quote that you gave, because it was very compelling, and I think it really sets the mood as to why you wrote this book. On page 14, let me go to there on the quote. It says, "When the #MeToo movement swept the nation, I heard many stories that sounded horrifyingly familiar. Stories of men who projected an impressive image in public, but were monsters in private. It would have been easy for me to join the media chorus condemning toxic masculinity, but as a Christian, I had to acknowledge that what God has created is intrinsically good. It is sin that has distorted and twisted his original good creation. The real problem is not an inherent flaw in masculinity itself. It's that American society has become secularized and has lost the biblical vision of manhood. So in a sense," you write, Nancy, "I've been writing this book my entire life." Now, I got to say, it's quite powerful, but would you mind explaining what you meant when you said, "I've been writing this book my entire life"?
Yes, thanks so much for that question. So I wrote an introduction to the book where I talk about my childhood experience. I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist?
Right.
And it was closed fist. He was punching us and kicking us and so on. And so I start the book in order to show that, well, as one psychologist put it, after he read my book, he wrote a review on Amazon, by the way, and he said, well, at least she's not writing from an ivory tower. Right?
Ah,
She's been in the trenches. And so, of course, I mean, you read that introduction, and I did go totally feminist for a while. I
yeah.
mean, that is a very natural experience after having an abusive father. At first, I went through a stage of seeing all men as basically evil and harmful. But it is true that um, part of my maturing as a Christian involved coming to grips with masculinity. I will tell you the deepest story. You may know my story because you have read my other books, that I became a Christian at L'Abri, which is the apologetics ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And it was apologetics that brought me back to the faith. I mean, I really had intellectual questions that needed to be answered. And Schaeffer was the first Christian that I ever encountered who
Mm,
actually answered my questions instead of implying, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have faith? Um,
right.
so it was an extremely big part of my conversion at my time at L'Abri and learning Christian apologetics. But what I have not said in my previous books about my conversion experience is that at L'Abri was also a psychiatric social worker. She was on staff there. Her name was Sheila Bird. We called her Birdie. And she was there because she recognized that for many young people, their barriers to Christianity are not only intellectual, but also emotional, especially kids who grow up in Christian homes who may have some conflict with their parents, for example, and especially pastors' kids and missionary kids. Birdie herself was a missionary kid. Um, at any rate, so part of my time at L'Abri was going to counseling sessions with Birdie, and she helped me to realize I had to go through an intense emotional, psychological, and spiritual healing of the trauma of my childhood. When I left home, I thought I'm going to wipe out my entire childhood. I'm going to start with a blank slate. I'm going to reinvent myself from scratch because my childhood had been so traumatic. And it was Birdie who helped me to see, no, you actually can't do that. And so an awful lot of my Christian life has been focused on healing from my father's abuse. And so this book comes very much out of my own personal experience.
Well, you know, there's actually a few things you and I have in common. One is that I was sexually molested when I was a
Mm.
child. And when you don't see justice, you know, this is in the 80s, there wasn't the social media and the movements that we have today, thank the Lord to some extent. But when you have to go through something like that, when you feel used and abused and something that you know is wrong, how do you reconcile that in a quote Christian home, right? And then when there's not justice, and so that's one thing that I definitely see, that the power of the Holy Spirit in your life as in mine. And then two, yeah, I mean, I was the same way when I left. I had, you know, faith in the Lord, but if it wasn't for Dr. Norman Geisler, somebody who took me under his
Oh,
wing
oh.
and spent countless, you know, dinners and, you know, drinking tea, and he loved pizza. We'd eat pizza and chicken wings and travel with him, you know, really opened my eyes to what a man of faith looks like, right?
Amazing.
Yeah, and
Amazing.
that was truly amazing. So it's amazing how you go through something toxic and damaging, but out of it, you know, by the grace of God, you can share these truths. So one thing I do want to talk about now, because you cited the American Psychological Association, and this is critical because this is still an institution that exists that is definitely putting out propaganda after propaganda after propaganda. And here in the book, you have here on page 17 that you say that the American Psychological Association issued its first ever guidelines for counseling men and boys in 2018. So this is just a few years ago. And you point out, Nancy, that it denounced, quote, traditional masculinity ideology as, quote, psychologically harmful, end quote. Now, here's my question, because when I saw that, I was startled by it. And I'm wondering, why is this particular research and denunciation of the APA so significant, and why is that so damaging to our society?
Oh, yes. Excellent, excellent question. Because what the APA, the American Psychological Association, does not recognize is the difference between a biblical view of manhood and the secular script for manhood, because in many ways the two are different. In my book, I go through a lot of the history of how the masculine script, the secular script, develops. So let me give you just one stage because I think it's one of the most important. One of the most important stages in the development of a toxic secular script for masculinity was the rise of Darwinism, because Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be the men who were rugged, ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. And so the message of evolution seemed to be to recover your true, authentic manhood is to rediscover the beast within. In other words, until then, men had been urged to live up to the image of God in them, and now men were being urged to live down to their animal nature. And so when people like the APA, secular organization, talks about masculinity, of course, for the most part, they're talking about that secular definition, which does include some toxic traits. And I think the most important thing we have to help people to see is that the biblical script for masculinity is quite different. It does, in fact, well, I'll just go from my chapter 3. I did research on what Christian men actually think, right? I wasn't so interested in the theologians and the pundits, right? I wanted to see how do Christian men actually function, because the secular world looks at Christians and especially evangelicals and says any notion of male headship in the home will lead men to be oppressive, domineering, tyrannical patriarchs.
Mm.
And so what I did is I looked at the social science data. Did it actually turn Christian men into these overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs? And the answer was no. I was actually stunned. I was blown away by how positive Christian men expressed their understanding of headship in the home, especially with my background, right?
Right.
I was totally ready to believe the secular narrative, which is, that evangelical men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. But there are researchers, social scientists, psychologists, sociologists who have been going into the Christian world and studying evangelical men. And so I used their research, especially in chapter 3, and I just quoted them.
Mm.
What do
Yeah.
they actually think headship means? Most of them did not say breadwinner, final authority, tiebreaker. Most of them said spiritual leader.
Right.
Spiritual leader, meaning if I'm going to lead my family, I have to be there first. I have to have a deeper relationship with God if I want my wife and children to. I have to go to church regularly, and bring my wife and children. I have to read the Bible regularly and have a rich spiritual life if I want to help my wife and children. So it was amazing. The most widely quoted passage was Ephesians 5.
Mm.
Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. When I researched abusive families, I encountered people who said, I never heard a sermon on that verse. But when a social scientist talk to committed church-going Christian men, invariably they cited Ephesians 5.
Yeah.
Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So in my book, what's unique about the book is I don't just sort of give theological principles. I actually went out and read the researchers so I could tell you what Christian men are actually like in
Right.
real life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you did a good job. And that I definitely encouraging our listeners and people watching to get their copy, because there was a lot of things that you put in there that I'm looking forward to in our own ministry at Stand Strong Ministries to implement. We'll be doing some men's outreach stuff this coming fall and next year in partnership with Focus on the Family. And so I want to definitely, Nancy, use some of your data. Well, let's transition into another area that was very fascinating that you discussed along the lines of what you were just saying. And this is also in your book, and it's found on page 25. You say, but while we focus on maybe 10% of powerful, successful alpha males, we have been blinded to the fact that on average, men are doing worse than in the past. Men are more likely than women to be homeless, to suffer mental illness, to wind up in prison, to commit suicide, to be murdered, to be addicted to drugs or alcohol. Men's workforce participation has dropped to depression era levels. I didn't know that until I read that. And then you said it doesn't show up in unemployment statistics because many men have stopped looking for work. In recent years, men's life expectancy has been gone down while women's has remained the same. And then you quote the New Scientist says, quote, being male is now the single largest demographic factor for early death, end quote. I got to tell you, Nancy, I mean, that's both like alarming but depressing. But why, when you were doing this research and you came up, you've been married for many decades, right? I know Michael's your son. Do you have other sons?
Yes, I have two sons.
See, so your mother who's raised boys, and it's like
Mhm.
when you looked at that, how staggering was that for you?
Yes, well, let me start with, you started with adult men. Let's start with boys.
Mm.
Boys are falling behind too at all levels of education. Boys are falling behind starting in kindergarten because they don't have the good fine motor control that most girls do
Right.
for things like coloring and using a scissors. And so
Right.
already in kindergarten, boys are feeling like, oh well, I'm not as good. And one author who wrote a book on it's called Raising Cain: The Emotional Life of Boys, and he said in schools already in elementary grades, boys are treated like defective girls. I thought that was a great quote. And I quote another educator in my book. She says, when girls were falling behind, we blamed the system, right? Discrimination. Now that boys are falling behind, what do we say? We say it's because they're too masculine. It's the masculine traits that are getting in the way. And so, in fact, I even quote Bill Maher.
Yeah.
Comedian
Yeah.
Bill Maher took on this question once, and he said, "These days, boys are being punished basically for acting like boys."
Yeah.
And to give a somewhat more professional quote, so this is a psychologist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, and she said, in my practice, I'm seeing more and more boys come in who feel defeated and demoralized because they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. And so, by the way, speaking of education, I stopped with kindergarten, but all the way through up
Hmm.
until high school, boys are falling behind. They're more likely to have problems in school, fall out of school, um, and and universities. I teach at a university, so I have to make sure I include this. Universities now, the average university is 60% female, 40% male.
Mm.
In fact, I teach at Houston Christian, and when I first came here a decade ago, we were 70-30, which was not uncommon in private schools. And there are schools now that are quietly uh, implementing um, affirmative action to get more male students because they don't want to go beyond 60-40. I mean, that's already bad enough. More women than men are going to graduate school. More women than men are even going to professional schools like law and medicine. So I say in my book, isn't it time to maybe have some compassion for men and boys? Um, in 1994, there was a Gender Equity Act passed that has poured billions of dollars into helping girls. And that's great. I mean, it's great that girls are moving ahead in education. We want to make sure we don't sound like we think that's a bad thing. It is a good thing. Keep in mind that most universities did not accept women until the mid
Right.
20th century.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I did not live any earlier. But the other side of the coin is now there are, depending on the study, I read one study that said 4 times as many scholarships for women as for men. Recently, I read a new study that said 10 times as many scholarships for women as for men. So I think it's time for us to start saying, maybe there's some ways we can help men and boys succeed better. The Brookings Institution had a study where they said parents now are more concerned about their boys becoming successful adults than about their
Mm.
girls becoming successful adults. So that's where we are now. And my book is arguing it's time maybe to have some compassion and come up with some programs to help men and boys.
To your point, Nancy, the great thing is just recently we dropped off our second oldest to college, and she did her dual enrollment just like her older brother did, and he
Mm.
landed up at the same university as she did, and that's Anderson. So it's a Christian university in South Carolina. But to your point, when we were at the parent day and the president was up there talking, they're joking about it, but almost 70% of the students at
Oh.
at at Anderson Christian University are women. And so they're just saying, man, you got a lot of opportunity. You're like 3-to-1 kind of a thing, right? So if you can't buy a date by the time you're a senior, then something's wrong with you. So they joke, ha ha ha. But then you look at saying, I got a son there, I got a daughter there. But when I looked at my son enrolling, they actually were providing scholarships, additional things for him as a male
Oh.
than they were for my daughter, because they have a lot of girls coming there, but they don't have a lot of guys coming there. So I was appreciative of that, because they are trying to say, look, we got to get more men here, because it's a needed thing. So you're right. There are some institutions that are seeing it, and it's especially, we're grateful when you see it in the Christian domain, because you can tend to overlook that or dismiss that. So that's pretty good. Now, one of the chapters I thought was very fascinating was in chapter 10, and you entitled it, "Have We a Religion for Men? How Muscular Christianity Sought to Save Manliness." So I'd like for you to explain for our audience the meaning behind the title, and whether you believe, Nancy, that the muscular, I should say, Christianity, movement is good or bad.
Yes, yes. So let me explain where it came from. It was called Muscular Christianity, and it came out of so uh, to back up very quickly. Men used to work with their wives and family all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And after the Industrial Revolution, work was taken out of the home. So men were no longer working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And actually, that is when we first start seeing negative language describing the male character, because many people began to say men in this industrialized workplace are losing the caretaking ethos that they had in the pre-industrial age, and they're becoming individualistic and egocentric and aggressive and ambitious and look out for number one and win at all costs. That kind of language. That's the first time you see negative language applied to the male character. And so people who think, well, maybe it started with the 1960s. No, no, you have to go much further back.
Mm.
uh, but in terms of the young men for the first time did not have their fathers all day in the home. We're so used to today that we don't realize how much consternation that raised,
Yeah.
that men were no longer working side by side with their sons throughout the day, introducing them to the skills that they would need in the adult life. Sociologists write things like, one of them says, we had for the first time a male identity crisis because boys did not have a model day to day of
Mm.
what it meant to be a man. Another historian says boys lost touch with the adult world because their fathers were now invisible throughout the day. In fact, there's one psychologist who calls it industrial fatherlessness, meaning that, of course, the father was technically still in the home, but he was gone all day. And so a lot of the issues we see today with fatherlessness started then. So all that to say, when when these boys grew up, they brought with them a kind of rebellion against society, because they've been raised without fathers, and so they become sort of unsupervised and wild. Again, you see this in the literature of the day. People began to say, I'll quote the leading psychologist of the 19th century. He said, never before has the American boy been so wild and so half orphaned.
Mm.
Isn't that an amazing
Wow.
phrase? Half orphaned because his father's not there anymore, day in and day out. And now the boy has been left up to female guidance. To continue the quote by the
Yeah.
psychologist, boys have been left up to female guidance in home, church, and school. Well, what happens then, as these boys grew up, people began being concerned that they had lost touch with what it meant to be a man. And so there was a huge concern in the late 19th century that men were no longer growing up on the farm. They were no longer tough, strong, physically strong. They were sitting behind a desk, pushing pencils all day. And so there was a concern. It entered, a new word entered the English vocabulary, over civilized, meaning that boys were growing up sort of soft and, well, to use the word of the time, even effeminate, in the sense that they were no longer those strong, strapping boys growing up on the farm. And so Christian churches at the time also were concerned about this. They were concerned that maybe the churches were becoming more effeminate. And I quote several, you know, uh, church leaders of the 19th century, like Spurgeon. Everyone knows Spurgeon, so I can quote him. So Spurgeon says, um, people have gotten the mistaken notion that to become a Christian, you need to become effeminate. And he says, no way. I want to assure you, young men, that you don't have to become effeminate to be a Christian. So this was the muscular Christianity movement. It was part of the broader concern that young men were no longer growing up as masculine as they had been when they grew up on the farm, and they were physically strong and courageous. And so there was a movement in the churches to affirm a very masculine understanding of Christianity, which I think was a good thing.
Yeah.
You asked me,
Yeah.
it was to a large extent, it was a good thing. It was a good course correction. because in the 19th century, even the churches had become more focused on women. For one thing, there were more women than men.
Right.
There have always been since the early church, but it got even worse in the 19th century with the two great awakenings. Tended to appeal more to women because they had a very intense emotional appeal, which seemed to apply more to women because women were thought to be more emotional. So all that to say, in the early 20th century, there was a movement called Muscular Christianity that that focused on reaching out to men and saying things like, Jesus was a masculine man, or Billy Sunday. We all know
Yeah.
Billy Sunday,
Yeah.
right? And he would say things like, if you don't accept Jesus, it's because you're not man enough. You need
Hmm.
to come down the aisle and be a man. And it takes a true man to be a Christian. And so, in many ways, this was an important course correction
Yeah.
over the sort of Victorian Jesus meek and mild of the Victorian age. So I think, yeah, on the for the most part, it was a very good correction, and it's something that churches are still wrestling with because the average congregation in America is still 60% women, 40% men. And so churches are still trying to figure out, how do we frame the gospel in a way that it is appealing to men.
Yeah, it's when I was growing up. It's like the shirts. Real men love Jesus, and real men love their wives. That's like you said, trying to show that this is really what men are to look like. And a lot of it was good. I mean, it was helpful for me, and then how we feminize things today, like you said. But we do see a change happening. That it's sad in my travels. Predominantly, doesn't matter the denomination I'm a part of,
Mm.
to go in there to do Christian apologetics or something on family, but you have a thriving women's ministry and the men's ministry is just non-existent. And yet you have these visionary guys, you have these guys who are CEOs, they're running companies, they're running teams, and there's not this high productive, high efficient men's group. And then when you do see it, it's because the men are leading the way God intended them to, and it sets the tone in the entire church. It's amazing. So I always sit there and scratch my head, and I have to tell you, I'll be honest, um, if there's not a presence of a men's ministry, that says a lot about the church, where they're at. So just a little side note for people out there listening. All right, so I want to do this as we're wrapping things up because it's great research, and then what you do is it's not just, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world, men are horrible, they're all dying off, like you said. That's the reality in some aspects of what's taking place, but you transition to bring out the positive, to focus on truth. And so one of the things I wanted to do in asking this question is to really get people to be attentive to say, okay, what are some practical things they can do, right? To turn the tide, so to speak. So all the fathers or men, even wives, mothers listening, what are some practical steps, Nancy, that, again, you're married, you got two boys. What are some practical steps for fathers to do to be more involved in the lives of their children?
Yes, I think it helps to have the historical context because, again, like I said, we kind of take today as unproblematic. This is how it's always been. No, it was not. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, which actually means most of human history, right? Because the Industrial Revolution was very recent in the West. Most of human history, men worked alongside their wives and children all day, and so fathers were very involved with their sons. And in fact, this was kind of a interesting, eye-opening fact. In the colonial era, most books on parenting, like sermons and child-rearing manuals, were written to fathers. They were not written to mothers, as most are today. If you go to a
Yeah, that's
typical
right.
bookstore today,
Yeah.
so they presumed that fathers were as involved with their children as mothers were. And in fact, that fathers were even more involved when it came to the intellectual and spiritual education of their children. In fact, a common word in the colonial era was house fathers. House fathers. I mean, we
Wow.
talk about housewives. They
Yeah.
talked about house fathers. And so sometimes the contrast can sort of shake us out of our modern lethargy and realize, well, maybe there was something good about the past that we want to recreate. So the reason fathers sort of got out of touch with their children was the Industrial Revolution. And again, already in the 19th century, you see this in the literature of the day. People began to lament, to protest that fathers were no longer as involved with their kids. Frances Willard was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. She was the most influential woman of the entire 19th century. And here's what she wrote. She wrote, "The father is the prototype of the Heavenly Father, and yet he's not even home except on the weekends. Now, how can that be healthy?"
Wow.
So what I do I have a whole chapter devoted to,
Yep.
well, can we flex the workplace a bit even today? There was a New York Times article, which is not in the book because it came out most recently, but it was reporting on a Harvard University study where 68% of fathers said, "I got closer to my children during the pandemic, and I don't want to lose that." So studies show, another one was 65%. That one's in the book. But fathers who had a chance to be closer to their children, this sort of a silver lining of the pandemic was that many fathers had a chance to work at least part-time from home.
Mm.
And they said, "Oh, wow, I actually like being with my kids. I like having closer relationships with my children." Sometimes it's easier to give an anecdote to sort of crystallize. So one of my graduate students was married to an IT professional who came home during the pandemic. And because he was home, he was able to be more involved with the homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch for the family every day. He was able to take his kids to soccer and choir practice. And he took up so much of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to start a part-time business, and the whole family benefited from the added income. And so I interviewed her husband, and he said, "Our family is so much more balanced. It's so much healthier than it used to be. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle."
Wow.
And then the final kicker was the time that I used to spend commuting to work every morning, I now spend praying with my wife. So sometimes an anecdote like that can really crystallize it. A lot of men are saying, "Well, wait a minute." Surveys show, by the way, I give a lot of surveys.
Yeah, you do.
Surveys show, surveys show that men report just as much work family conflict as women do. They just don't talk about it as much.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid they will be accused of not being committed to their jobs or whatever. But many of them really do want to have more time with their kids. And by the way, I also quote CEOs because we have to persuade business that it's good for them too.
Yep.
One CEO I quoted said, "We were always afraid of remote work because we thought workers would slough off, right? They wouldn't get their work done." And he said, this is a direct quote, "The pandemic completely exploded that fear." People working from home, we did not see any decrease in productivity. If anything, because they could go back to it after the kids were in bed at 11, they actually put in more work, more hours. We had to tell them to stop.
Yeah.
So we have to put it on both sides. It's a win-win. We have to encourage businesses to see. Here's how one CEO put it, and I did quote this in the book. "When companies give fathers more time to be better fathers, they make better workers." So it's a win-win on both sides.
That's really true. I was talking to one of our advisors. He's at a big corporation. They employ 110,000 people around the world. And of course, they had a lot of office space around the globe. And so they, because of this hybrid, they're leasing off some of that. And it's actually a good thing because other companies are getting lesser price, point for them. But he said that one, like you said, and he's in HR. He's a big executive in HR. So he says the productivity's gone up.
Oh.
He says a lot of them are more in tune in their marriages with their kids, and so that's a good thing. And so I think really the practical thing is just look for ways to spend time with your family, right? And then wanting to know that dad wants to spend time. Years ago when I was in mega church world, doing a lot of ministry, like raising 4 PKs, you alluded to that earlier. So they kind of have a complex a little bit. And I was trained by a great pastor friend of mine in Arizona, still pastoring today. His kids are out of the house now and married. But I remember when he was raising them, when he was engaged with either one of his staff members or somebody of the church, and again, his kids were not being rude, but he always acknowledged his children and just didn't ignore them and just hand them off to mom or someone else. He would hug them and just say, hey, let me talk to the so-and-so and I'll be right with you. And I just, as a young pastor and a young husband about to have kids, I was like, that is a really good model. So over time, doing that with my kids, but then over time, Nancy, me having the desire to say, one of my prayers is that I want to be able to work from home someday, that I could be present with my kids, because we pulled them out and we homeschooled them. And now my two older ones are off in college. And recently I had a conversation with my son where he's like, he wanted to travel and make a lot of money and do development. And he's like, but Dad, at the end of the day, he's like, I want to have a family like you have. And I was like, wow. And I have to say, because what you said is, I prioritize with my wife. That's the key. Our not just my scheduling, but just my presence in the home. And I will never change it. I mean, you're right. It is an amazing thing. I just talked to a guy in the men's group yesterday. He's in a new job. He's got to commute 2 days a week, but at least he gets to do 3 days a week at home to be a part of, things that are happening with his kids, taking them to lunch, you know what I mean? That type of thing. And that's a good thing. So hopefully men will take advantage of that. So the last question I have, Nancy, as we wrap this really insightful conversation, is at the end of your book, you do address the abuse problem in Christian homes. And I'm glad you did this, because I know abuse can take all different shapes and sizes: verbal, neglect, physical, sexual. One, you had shared that you were abused. I was sexually abused by a family member. So my question is, because I'm even asking this question as a pastor for 25 years, how can churches respond more effectively to this problem?
Yes, we're at a good time because there are many Christian therapists and others who are starting to give a much more positive direction on where to go. When I was young, all the books blamed the wife, and many still do. In other words, if you would just love more, if you would forgive more, if you would make his favorite foods, if you would lose weight and look better, if you would have more sex, he would blossom into the man you want him to be. I am actually quoting from an abused wife who was told that by by her pastor. He will blossom into the man you want him to be. Well, it turns out that that's just not true to human nature. We all know that if somebody is truly a bully, whether it's on the playground or whether it's a belligerent nation in international affairs, if you acquiesce, if you placate them, they get worse. They take it as permission to get worse. And so, fortunately, there are now books coming out, they're relatively new, saying the answer to any sort of abuse in the home is Matthew 18. Right? I mean, that's from Jesus' own mouth, right? Matthew 18, where he does say if somebody's sinning, the correct response is to confront them. No, not in a revengeful way, not in retaliation, but in terms of restoration. How do you restore them? You have to get them to acknowledge that what they're doing is sin and that it's wrong. um, there are for example, I'll just give you one, a psychologist named Chris Moles. He is a pastor who works with men in court-ordered counseling. By the way, most abusive men in counseling are usually court-ordered.
Yeah,
They don't go there
yeah,
voluntarily.
right.
So Chris Moles says, he's very clear on this. He says, you don't start, here's the message to churches: you don't start by treating it as a marriage problem. He says it's not a marriage problem. If somebody is so intent on getting their way that they're willing to hurt the people
Yes.
around them,
Hmm.
then it's a sin. Is he? I think the title of his book actually is "The Heart of the Abuser." It's sin in the heart of the abuser. It's not in the relationship dynamics. It's in the heart of the abuser. And more Christians are starting to realize this. But on a practical level, where the rubber hits the road is pastors have typically treated any sort of abuse as a relational problem, and they bring the couple in together.
Yeah,
Well, it doesn't work, because
right.
if there's genuine abuse, the wife is not going to admit it in front of her husband. Why? Because she's going to be punished later. I give the example of a couple, and again, this is from a non-Christian who counsels men in court-ordered counseling. And one day, he got to the point where he thought the couple was ready to deal with their abuse, and he got the wife to admit that her husband was physically abusing her. And in the counseling session, he got teary-eyed and seemed very broken and very repentant. But on the way home, he kept one hand on the steering wheel while he reached over and grabbed his wife's hair and slammed her face into the dashboard repeatedly, saying, "I told you never to talk to anyone about that," except that he used extremely coarse
Yeah.
language. And he uses that an example as you do not, when there's genuine abuse, you do not bring husband and wife into the office together. You do need to deal with the separate. So on a very concrete level, that's probably one of the most common mistakes that churches can overcome. And the second most common being that, it's not the wife's fault. If a husband is willing to actually hurt his wife and kids, it's the husband who needs to be addressed. You
Right.
cannot stop a bully by you cannot fix another adult by being nice to them. I'm sorry. It's just not human nature. So
Yeah.
I do have, because in my book, what I show that the social science research, so psychologists and sociologists who've studied evangelical Christians have told us that men who actually are committed Christians and live it out test out as the highest in
Yeah.
terms of being loving husbands and fathers, lowest level of divorce, lowest level of domestic violence. But evangelicals who are merely nominal, who might check the Baptist box, for example, on a survey, but who do not attend church, or rarely, if at all, test out as worse than secular men. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They're the least involved with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence. And so that's what we're up against as a church. On the one hand, we should be encouraging the men who are doing a good job. You know,
Yeah.
um,
You're right.
I had to go dig in the academic literature to find these studies.
Yeah.
They're not out there. So this is one of the main reasons I wrote the book. Let's get that data out there. And this is not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical evidence. This is evidence-based findings that Christian men do very well. And it's time to start encouraging them. I had a graduate student who was a leader of the women's ministry in a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. And on Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I was very careful not to take a scolding tone, because what I want to do is use this data from the social scientists to encourage Christian men. In fact, let me give you a quote. Sometimes
Oh,
it's
yes. Yeah.
easier.
Please do.
It crystallizes with a quote. So this is my go-to sociologist, in the sense that he did the largest study. He's Catholic. His name is Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia. And to give you some sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. So this is a New York Times article. And he says, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. And of course, they focus on the wives because the presumption is,
Yeah.
if you hold any sort of male headship, that will turn you into an overbearing, oppressive, domineering, tyrannical patriarch.
Yep.
So they focus on the wives. Actually, the wives, the happiest of all wives in America, are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And so this is, like I said, this is from the social sciences.
Yeah.
This is empirical data. We need to get that into the churches to encourage the men who are doing well.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, it is very important that we start reaching out to these men who are on the fringes, who are nominal Christians, and who are actually worse than secular men, and who are, if I may say so, who are kind of ruining the reputation of Christian men. And so the church does need to figure out a more strategic way to draw them in and disciple them so that they understand the Christian understanding of masculinity and headship.
Well, as a Christian man, who's been married for over 20 plus years with 4 kids and working in churches, I thank you for doing that, because you're right. When I was doing my book, Challenging Conversations, I have a chapter on divorce and remarriage. Divorce alone is something we don't talk about. And we have to look at it in those cases, like you said, those nominal evangelicals, you're right. They are the most abusive. Sadly, I've had that in my own side of the family in some cases where there's Christians in my family, supposed Christians or nominal at best. So they may be self-identifying, but they were not bearing the fruit. And one in particular, had a restraining order against him because of how he was treating his wife and kids. And I am like, this happens in my own, family. It's happening in churches, and a lot of us don't know what to say, or we turn a blind eye to it, or there's a stigma, or we marginalize them. So you're right. Empirically, when you look at it, that is supporting what the Bible teaches. You said Ephesians 5. If you have love and respect, that is God's, that's his DNA in the culture of a man and woman's marriage with holy matrimony. And that's a beautiful thing. And we have to affirm that rather than, like you said, scolding people, because that's the last thing men are not going to, even men who are not abusive, but they're kind of passive. They don't want to jump in and get their hands dirty because they're intimidated or they have insecurity or fear of rejection. Even those men don't want to be scolded. They're not going to respond well that way. So you're right in that. So I definitely will share with you that we are going to take a lot of this information and continue to share this in churches so we can get a better response and they can get back on track to how we're equipping men to be godly and to lead their homes in the future, particularly a lot of the Gen Zers, right, Nancy, who over 10 million Gen Zers are raised in a single home, and over 80% of that is by women, right? And so right there, you have a big chunk of Gen Z who do not have not only do they not have a man influence, they certainly do not have a godly influence of a man in their life. So I thank you so much, Nancy. Thanks for coming on the show. Thank you for writing this book, and we just appreciate the content that you share with us today.
Oh, thank you. Yes, and thanks for your experience too. That does underscore many of the themes of the book.
Yeah,
I'll give you just one
sure.
short study because this is also encouraging. It was the first ever study done of cross-cultural concepts of masculinity by a guy who's not a Christian, anthropologist, and he found that no matter how they define masculinity, some cultures were more warlike and some others were more peaceful. They all shared what he called the 3 Ps, that a man by nature is called to provide, protect, and procreate, or become a parent, build into the next generation. And I thought that was amazing because he's not a Christian and he's talking to cultures that are not Christian. And yet they all understand that a man's unique strength, because men are stronger and bigger and faster than women, that men's unique strength is not given them just to get what they want. They're made in God's image, and they do understand that their strength is given them to provide and protect and raise the next generation. Um, I thought that was really that was encouraging as well, because we might call that general revelation, right?
Yeah.
That's general revelation means what we know outside of Scripture. All cultures understand that the good man is the man who takes care of those he loves, who provides, protects, and procreates. And so that's helpful because we realize that the scriptural ethic does not impose something alien on the masculine nature. It does not, this is not an alien imposition of something. This fits with their truest nature.
Yeah.
The biblical ethic fits with who men really are and who they were created to be.
Well said. Thank you so much, Nancy. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, my friends, I hope my conversation with Nancy has emboldened you to continue to pray as we do see a resurgence of God-fearing men that are loving their families and are able to defend the Christian faith. If you are a man who listened to this show or you watched this show, let us know how this has impacted you by emailing us at info@standstrongministries.org, and know that we are praying for you, and we are praying that you will be more devoted to living a life that is pleasing to the Lord. For more information about Nancy Pearcey and to get some of her books, you can check her out at nancypearcey.com. As always, thanks for listening, and make sure to share this episode with your friends. Until next time, keep having those challenging conversations.